about to get rolling, everybody. I'll pull it back so I can see my cheekboard.
Training the dogs is one thing, but training the people, that's really where it is. Because now they can be better to their dogs. Their dogs can trust them more, and they're going to be more successful. And I've done a lot of coaching of people at Nationals, and it's really what turns me on, is putting together the dog-handler combination and helping them understand each other. And, well, success is bound to happen when you can do that.
Keep track of time. Hey, everybody, and welcome. I guess we're about ready to get rolling here. If you may have just seen the Purina commercial and, well, the Elite Retrievers commercial. I hope you guys like that. I'm here with my good friend Andy Attar. Hey, buddy.
How you doing there, Pat?
We're getting ready to do a workshop tomorrow, and, well, we're talking dogs tonight, so we saved the best for last. We got our 6th and final Purina Masterclass. And I want to welcome everybody to, I guess it's a Wednesday evening. Hope you're doing well. We're getting close to the holidays. Hey, I guess first of all, I need to certainly thank Purina, Ray Vogt, Carl Gunzer, the team over there that kept these master classes going. Thank you very much. I know everybody, you guys out there, have really appreciated it, and thanks to Purina, they've kept it going for us. So tonight, we're going to talk about, well, 40 years, huh? Andy and I, we started high school in hunting and got a retriever, just kind of like probably started about like everybody out there, like you guys at home. And look where it's taken us. Here we are 40 plus years later, and we're going to reminisce on that. And we're going to share some thoughts that we think are pretty profound about the evolution of the retriever training game. I guess I'm going to say that for lack of a better word. We're going to talk about the evolution. We're going to talk about how the dogs have changed in our 40 years. We've got some thoughts on that. And then we're going to tell you a couple stories. I'm going to have to read one of the stories because Andy's, mutual friend of ours, Scott Leonescu and Hawk are one of our success stories, and Hawk passed away this summer. But there's some great lessons to be learned there, and Andy wrote a great little story on Hawk. And he's going to make me read it because he doesn't think he can get through it. If you don't think professionals love and appreciate these dogs, well, you couldn't be further from the truth. So, all right, Andy, I'm looking at our board here on the left. We talk about the evolution. We talked about where we came from, and we described it briefly there. But really, our first exposure, we grew up in Northwest Indiana, outside Chicago, and our first exposure really was with, and we called them conventional trainers. That word doesn't even mean anything anymore. But what we meant by conventional trainers, it was pre-e-collar.
Yep.
The techniques that were used were archaic, I guess, in today's standards. You know what? But these guys were good trainers, and it's the way a lot of different animals were trained.
And very successful.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was on that podcast kind of giving the history of that group. River Oaks is an area on the Indiana-Illinois border, and River Oaks Kennels. I think that was John Trapaz, because he owned River Oaks Corky, which, if you know anything about the history of field trial dogs, River Oaks Corky is the highest pointed retriever in AKC history. Well, John Trapaz, from right on the Indiana-Illinois line, was the original owner of Corky. Mm-hmm. Sold him to Mike Flannery, where he went on to have an incredible career. But there was a group of blue-collar, absolutely blue-collar guys that worked in the steel mills, the oil refineries. I know Donnelly Printing. They printed the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and these guys,
They would get off of work like at 4:30, and they would do the Chinese fire drill to get just enough training with their dogs. And that's actually how we met them. Do you remember we were hunting in a place, and we weren't quite sure we had permission, and they came in and they were running a water blind. They had a water blind planted already, and we didn't know anything about any of that stuff. And we watched them start to train, and we just jumped out of the weeds and said, "What are you doing?" And we became their bird boys real quick.
we're fresh meat for them.
Yep.
And like I said, we talked today, Andy and I, as we were planning for this, so many stories came up, so many things we want to share with you. The technique back then, you didn't have a means of correcting a dog at a distance. You either screamed at them, somebody jumped out of the bushes with a buggy whip to spook them when they were doing something wrong.
Ran after them.
Well, they called it tennis shoe training because you didn't have bellies like I've got right now because when you did that. And they used, with bird dogs and a lot of these dogs, they would shoot them with birdshot at a certain distance where the intention was to sting them and not hurt them.
For things like not sitting on a whistle or breaking, cheating the water. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
We saw all that. We didn't know any other way.
And we were right on the cusp of when things were changing. Mm-hmm. And, it was just, they'd call the dog in, they used to have these leather quarts. They were
loaded quarts
with lead, and they were heavy, and they'd strap a dog for being bad. But, the technique of training humans, children, animals 40, 50 years ago, well, it makes us cringe now, does it not?
It does.
And I guess I'm just thankful for the evolution. Now, I'm sure these guys, they train today, they train in the methods we use today. They would have evolved.
Almost every successful field trialer, without exception, has to be close to what we're going to talk about today and how we train.
So I'm looking at our next bullet point. We talked about where we came from there and that area, and we were in just at the tail end of our high school. You were getting ready to go to college. I was working in my dad's insurance business, and that's where we started. We were 18, 19 years old then. Right. And it was 1980. And now we're, 43 years later. Andy, you wanted to reminisce on the first time you went to a field trip.
Well, we were talking today about how things have changed in our dog lifetime. And I used the example, the first time I went to a field trial, out of the 50 dogs that ran an open on the water blind, you would say like 25 of them didn't do a very good job. They had a bunch of whistles. Some of them had sloppy whistles. They had sloppy sits. They weren't attentive. And maybe they got through, maybe they didn't. And at least 20 of those dogs who did a decent job maybe were really intimidated. And we talked about that. What those forms of pressure to get them to listen, what it did to their overall attitude. So there was this real disparity of, 30 or 40 years ago. There was always a couple really good dogs, but there was also a lot of either kind of nervous dogs that act like they were doing it only because they had to, or there was the dog that didn't act like it was overly trained and was inconsistent. It would not be uncommon that many years ago back then a 200-yard landline was pretty far, that a lot of dogs wouldn't stop at the end of the landline. And some of the better dogs, like that pick line, those dogs ran really straight, but they get about 2 whistles out of them. So
you know about Highwood,
Pacers.
Pacers.
Yep. Okay. Yep. And he would run as straight as an arrow, but boy, if you had to stop more than a couple times, it could be trouble. And today, when you go to a field trial and you see 50 dogs, like 40 of them are happy. They're pretty well behaved, and they act like they're trained. And the difference between success now and success when we started was today you don't finish an open because you had one too many small hunts or maybe 5 extra whistles on a blind. Back then, you picked your dog up for not getting in a pothole that a qualifying dog could do today very easily.
Because the typical blind was a channel blind.
A channel blind or just
get in the water and stay in the water. They talked about, that's really when you heard the term, they had to get the picture of the blind.
And as soon as that happened, we were jumping ahead. But as soon as dogs got the picture, then judges started going to more contrary situations, which again we're jumping ahead a little bit, which made the dogs who were going to be successful, they had to be smarter dogs. They had to be smart, and they had to work with a handler. Like, you don't have to get in the water right away. Now you got to get in the water. So we're getting ahead of ourselves. But that's where that came from. That, like, looking back at the early field trials that we were involved with and compared to now. And I think how you started this thing about how the conventional trainers back then didn't have use of the collar, or when they used it, it was one button on the collar only, and it was really hot for most dogs. And there was the biggest challenge trainers faced was teaching a dog how to react to that negative stimuli, that much correction. And there were terms used in those days, we use them today still a little bit, but a dog has to be properly conditioned. And being conditioned really meant you had to tolerate high amounts of electricity and stay put and listen to what you needed to listen to. And today, it's not the opposite, but dogs have to be conditioned, but we now look at dogs a lot more individually. And so we don't consider that all dogs have to be on a level 7 and they have to take that level. Now we adapt to their personalities, and some dogs get lighter amounts of pressure, they get more repetition. And today, by today's collars, with the wonderful stuff we can do right on the transmitter with lowering the intensity, that's been really helpful too.
Those dogs, I guess at one point they had to sacrifice. They either had to decide were they going to have a dog that had a good attitude or was under control, and it was hard to have both. And
it was hard to use for a dog. It was hard to maximize his brain when he was under those high amounts of pressure, physical pressure. And when I see a dog panicking, we talk about this a lot too. Sometimes if you, by using a lot of pressure, you send them into like a survival mode, you're taking away their brain power, or our want to have them to use their brain. And back then we didn't have much choice. I mean, we were talking today about when we trained a few Chesapeakes back then, and they are known to be really sensitive. And so you have this really hot one button collar and a dog with no go, and you'd want to force him by your side, and you had to judiciously decide whether you were going to risk the chance of burning him because he didn't go and get bit. Like, that opened up a whole can of worms, right? Most of us don't even think of that anymore. I mean, we have gotten so smart and so efficient with electricity that just so rarely happens.
so we talked about the types of dogs that thrive then. Because you're right, it was either that run through a brick wall kind of dog that that they could have just the right amount of fear instilled in the dog, which is really what it was, so that the dog stayed under reasonable control, but still wanted to retrieve better and still could,
Want to get the bird.
right. And I say fear in that because it's hard to imagine when you call a dog in from 200 yards away and then you hit him with a lead-loaded quart on a command, that there is a true understanding of what that correction is for.
200 yards away from you, he made a mistake, and now he's going to come back in. That's what my mom used to do.
Right. And so,
Where
like,
so
your
I-
dad gets home?
Yeah.
Well, and so that then the dog goes out and now he's a little more worried and he's more attentive because he's worried. Now, I mean, there's a certain degree of that today, but in that day, that was the only thing you had. And so once there was enough, and again, intimidation or just that level that the dogs were reasonably compliant, and they could mark well enough. I mean, so there was a narrow window of dogs, and the dogs that thrived were pretty tough.
Yeah, they were tough.
Physically tough and difficult to manage for a lot of people. Now, the professionals that we know and some of these hardcore amateurs, well, they weren't afraid to get their elbows dirty, and they would go in and get rough with them. And but a lot of the owners and amateurs, and well, I remember Jack Martin and
The bull.
I mean, and I'll tell you, big guy, 6'4", won the 1980 national, I think it was, with Oregon Sky.
Yeah.
But Jack was rough and tumble, big fireman, football player guy. But he said, I remember hearing him saying this. He said, the collar ruined the game. I said, why is that, Jack? He says, because now women can play the game. And that was an era where, oh my God, people actually thought that way. But the only reason I even say that, because it wasn't, obviously it's not the female, but it allowed people to train and get respect and get dogs under control without physically having to manhandle.
So we're jumping ahead a little bit, but I think to finalize this part so we can get back to where I want to get. Today, we want our dogs to be thinkers. That's what we want our dogs to do. We don't want them to worry about the amount of pressure they're going to get when they make a mistake. Now, I say that we can't enable them to be disobedient or irresponsible. So let's leave that for now, because we got moved around just a little bit. You asked me a question today when we were just kind of getting ready for this. How do I think the dogs have changed?
Well, that's right. We talked about that right there. We talked about that as far as those dogs of that era were big, powerful, burly kind of, you think like an NFL lineman kind of guy, down in the trenches kind of dog.
Let's say that the ones that were successful in field trials, because there were a lot of dogs that weren't that way, but they just couldn't get through the rigors of a lot of training methods. So typically, dogs that finished nationals then and a little earlier were males, were a little tougher. I mean, there was a point in time when all of a sudden you saw more females winning nationals. And I'm not saying there wasn't some females before. I think of one of them, Dandy. She was and again, we're talking about the old days. Like, there were plenty of really good dogs there. Don't get me wrong. There were plenty of good dogs, and there were some trainers that did not use all these methods, and they were successful. But conventionally, most people did this to be successful. But let me.
And there weren't exceptions. You're right. You mentioned Dandy. What about your Rockodon? Don Straight.
That's straight stuff, sure.
Now, I never saw your Rockodon run, but they said in the era of intimidation and
she was
brutality, they said the hardest he ever corrected her was with his hat. So she was a very soft dog that maybe just had the right balance, but she was the exception, not the norm.
So to answer the question, if we can do this now, to answer the question in my experience, in our experience, how have things changed? How have the dogs changed? This is what you wanted me to say today, because the way I would look at this would be, understand with somebody that's been training as long as we have, you have different lenses of like different views. Like when you first get started, you kind of do what worked in the past. You listen to your mentors. You listen to, you read. We read a lot of stuff from Rex. We were enamored with Rex. You spent some time there. You brought a lot of that stuff back to me and a few other people. And so when you begin to train professionally, you train like 15 dogs, and you're like, imagine being my first dog. I feel sorry for that dog, but you're mimicking what you're told to do. Okay, so there's that period. So that's that. There's a lens right there, and so you can't really comment. I can't really comment yet about how dogs have changed because I have that zero experience at that point. Then you get to the point where you start to own some of your training and you begin to modify the things that you were mimicking, right? And I think it's a pretty common learning curve. And before I get to the last one, I have to give credit to my mentor, was Mike Clardy. And when I was in that transition, when I was in that stage, once I started finding things out on my own and realizing that some of those methods weren't aligned with my personality or probably aligned with how things should happen, then came Mike. And Mike was the first person in my experience, I didn't have many at that time, I suppose, but Mike was concerned about how dogs think. And then how my training impacts their thinking. Like, if you'd have said that 40 years ago, I'm not quite sure a lot of people would have, grasped that. So that middle stage, which is probably the most learning stage for a trainer, is you are trying to keep a few of the things that worked for you from the past that were really good. Like the guys we met that were old school. We'll just call them old school guys, real direct. And when they used the collar, it was a punishment kind of training. That was
it replaced the shotgun.
a shotgun. There was a lot of good things that I think we both drew from. Number one, they worked really hard. There was no replacement for working a dog a lot. Number two, they really thought that marking their dogs was really important. And number three, probably from Trapas, that he was kind of the ringleader there. They worked in training really hard on putting birds in places where dogs had to really work to get them. And for somebody who's new, that may not seem so important, but it's really important. We not struggle, but we try to do that always in our training, right? I'm not talking about puppy training, but I'm talking about as you're advancing dogs towards all age, you're really trying to get dogs used to working for birds where they may not be used to looking for them all the time, given into factors, whatever. And so when you get into that middle stage, that like the one you're starting to own your own training, and then you're modifying it from the past. And like me, I'm lucky enough to have somebody like Mike who he didn't know a lot then either. Yeah, I was lucky enough to be in a week, because you were there too for a while, in on his early stuff, and he was learning too. But he always would tell us, he would all the time, be worried about how you're influencing them. Be worried, not worried, it's not the right word. Consider what they're thinking after this, what their takeaway is, from the correction. And then the final stage of this, of course, is once you get some experience and you have some success. Now there's the lens that you can now answer the question, how have dogs changed from when I first got started? That's, to me, I have to go through those three layers. And today we have dogs that are dance partners. What happens at a really, in an all-age stake, a challenging all-age stake with a handler and a dog is a dance. And 40 years ago, it was more like you were directing them to do something. But like I've been to the last couple of national amateurs, and to be there in the 10th series and to watch these teams work, and 4 dogs in a row have handled, and maybe there's going to be a different strategy. You're going to take a different bird, or maybe you and your dog are going to figure out where that bird is, and you're going to be able to talk him into that bird. Last year's national amateur, it was the reason the dogs won. Who won? Because they made this tremendous decision at the line for the last bird. And that including our dog Maddox, who was in incredible shape. Maddox missed a bird by that much.
Yeah.
And you could say that was a little lucky. You could whatever you want to say, but every one of those handlers, it was there's so many good handlers there, and that was probably only one of the few tests where you could, as a spectator, really see the line and watch the dogs. And man, it was really wonderful to see. So the difference is 40 years ago, a long-winded answer to this question. 40 years ago, it was you as a handler, you were more of a director, and now you are a dance partner. And
Okay.
and you could almost use that same analogy with how the dogs have changed. We are now seeking more than ever dogs that are not like the ones that can tolerate a tremendous amount of pressure. We are not seeking, most of us are not seeking ones that will run through a brick wall to get a bird. We are now seeking dogs that have a brain, they let us access their brain, and they're physically, mentally, and emotionally committed to wanting a bird. And they're not unhappy and displeased about doing it for us as well.
Well, there's our question then. Have the dogs changed the training, or did the training change the dogs?
Yeah.
Because would the style of training today worked with dogs of 40 years ago?
I mean, there's a lot to consider there. I mean, there's you think about the breeding aspect and the males that are chosen most of the time, at least back then. You looked at the males as the ones that were going to carry, the genetics on, which is like, and that's another big thing. Now we really look at our bitches more than ever.
Right.
But so if somebody had a kennel full of dogs, like if somebody just trained like us 50 years ago, like all of a sudden we got really smart and we, made our own collars and we were really patient and we created a lot of success that way. Just say we did. Would everybody else jump on our wagon and want to breed to our dogs kind of thing? I guess what you're asking is, could we have trained back then like this with those kind of dogs?
Well, I can remember, my early professional career when on post Tangent, after I left Lardy and I moved to Michigan and started, and I can remember many dogs that the collars weren't hot enough. The dogs, I mean, it wasn't just their pain tolerance. I don't know if they were just that tougher in general, but we always were looking for the hottest collar we could make, and we tried to modify it to do it. And now it's the opposite.
All right, so to answer the question, I think there's a little shift in perspective that needs to happen there. I think if you had those dogs today, you would not train them the same way.
Okay.
So you went at those dogs more directly. When those dogs responded and we used to use the word clamor all the time. I don't know if people use that anymore. We would refer to a dog who, once it gets a significant collar correction, instead of like emotionally reacting, it would actually just kind of hide within itself to survive.
But we didn't think it was that then.
We didn't think that, but you know it now, Pat.
Right.
That's
Sure
what I'm
we do.
saying.
Yeah.
So take that same dog and instead of putting a second collar on them or looking for what we used to do back then, every once in a while, like put a lip clip on them, or, even make the collar hotter,
Change the contact points. Right.
change the contact points. Actually, in a lot of ways, we could sit here and look at each other right now and say, no, that could have been exactly the opposite thing. Like, it wasn't that some of those dogs weren't that tough. They just couldn't react to pressure properly. And in what you do now, you have people come to you all the time that their dogs are poorly conditioned. And I'm sure you see some of that. And I would bet any money that you are so much smarter now and you don't put that dog in the spot where it acts like it's got to only survive and not function. You're not just you. We are so much better now than ever before. If you see a dog who's going to start doing that, man, you redirect really quick. You don't want to get into that. Now, let's differentiate between that dog and a dog who has so much prey drive. He won't give you any attention. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a different story.
There were plenty of those, too.
And there were a lot more there back then than there are now, but we still have those. And they don't survive much with me anymore. Like they
don't get bred. So you don't,
because
they're not, when they're to that extreme, they're not fun to train.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, I think about like some of the really hard dogs you train, when Pat and I trained together for a couple of years as professionals at Mike's, and then you went off and had your own kennel, and I stayed at Mike's. So there were like 10 years that I stayed with Mike, like maybe 9 more years, and you pretty quickly, you and Mary at the time, had a real successful beginning run, you guys were pretty successful right off the bat, and we talked a lot. We would go to the same field trials 3 or 4 times a year. We'd stay in the same room. We talk about like we're talking now, and I'm thinking about some dogs that fit into that tough category, like that Rocky of Terry Beach's. Now,
Tyrone.
and I say Rocky, Tyrone, and
He was that old time dog.
yes, but he wasn't a clamor though. He was that
No.
prey-driven son of a bitch that
Yeah.
it was worth taking a licking to go get a bird. And to me, very few people could have trained him. Like I couldn't believe how the work you got out of him, and it took about as much time as 3 dogs a lot of times, right? You think?
And you saw some incredible talent that you just.
did. And you made it worth it for you. And it did, and he turned out to be a very successful dog with a disabled handler, and and Terry Beach was the owner who ended up running him relatively successfully.
Well, and he finished a couple nationals, and then, but boy, he was a handful. I called him a savage. I was thankful to have him, but I'm not sure I'd want to trade another one like him.
If you saw a dog like that today, and
No.
you were in my spot, like you got it easy now because people train with you for a period of time. You're like, hey, good luck. Here's some homework. But like if you had, if you had to now, be like if you were me and you have to like say, okay, I'll take this dog, and what do? You say I don't like this kind of dog anymore, or it's not worth the energy. It's not fair to him.
Well, it isn't. And Tyrone, it wasn't, at the end of the day, it wasn't pressure that changed him. It was simply work volume and just, keeping his mind engaged with different things, So there was a real psychological approach to that because just being, fighting fire with fire didn't work, and we had a very patient owner and you saw incredible talent in there and you were hungry enough to try to get the most out of it.
So, and we're going to talk about this in a minute too, but as I get older, I get more romantic. And my takeaway really about Tyrone and Terry is the romantic idea of that crazy lunatic dog ending up working for a lady in a wheelchair that could not go after him. Like at some point in time, he would have recognized, if you can't come after me, you're not going to get my respect, or I'm not going to listen to you. But so that is one, I think, and I wouldn't have probably appreciated that when I was younger, but
Right.
that's a real cool thing. And that's a real tribute to the
And it was her other dog, Rocky, that she developed a real rapport with. Who?
Am I mixing those?
Well, there was River Oaks Way to Go Rocky,
Yeah.
and Tyrone was River Oaks Way to Go Soul Man, and they were both around the same time. Rocky ended up, getting all his titles. Terry ran him in a couple nationals. Terry ran Tyrone, and I'd like to say that maybe the story that they went happily off into the sunset, but really that Terry had become disabled enough that actually John Russell ran Tyrone more at the end of his career,
Yeah.
and he
Okay.
finished a national with him. But your lesson and message is true, is absolutely true, and he was that savage kind of a dog that just would never quit no matter what. Had such a drive that the perseverance was off the charts.
You know what a good dog to me is today?
What's that?
It's as it would be the same as it was 40 years ago. And we'll get to Hawk in a minute. It's the dog that tries to figure out what you want and still has a prey drive and still wants to go get birds. When I first started, I had a few. And I didn't recognize it. I didn't treat, like I had, when Lottie began her career, Lottie is one of the most celebrated retrievers of all time.
Only dog to win 3 Open Nationals.
And then it was a National Derby winner at that time. That's how they did that.
And you own Lottie as a puppy.
And I owned her as a puppy, and I sold her I sold her to Mary Howley when she was like a year old, maybe 11 months old. I had no idea. I was not experienced enough to recognize that in her. But one of her bazillion attributes was that, imagine this wild Lebanese trainer pushing her way too hard and asking her to do way too many things. That'd be me, not him. her sitting there going, what the hell does he want me to do? And does it. Imagine her winning her first national at 4.
Yeah, I was there. I could have said the answer.
And being handled towards things that were, in so many ways over her head. And she's with Mike, Lardy's running her, and she's like looking at him and saying, what do you want me to do? I'll do it. And never even consider being too sensitive not to go, or, not enter cold water. I mean, she had it all. That's back then. We have some of those dogs today.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned it a little bit. The part of the success with Terry was eventually one of her dogs, if not both of them, ended up saying, "I'm not quite sure what she wants, but I'm gonna figure out what she wants, and I'm gonna do it, and I'm gonna get the bird too." Because oftentimes when dogs get to a point where they're so giving, they're like, it's not really that important for me to get the bird anyway. I'd just rather make you happy. And
Okay.
Really good field trial dogs, like we're mentioning these dogs now, they want the bird. They're prey driven. They get a big kick out of doing it right. They want to go a long way to get the bird. They don't mind getting into cold water, and they want to do it your way. And when they can't figure it out and you correct them, they're like, oh, they don't get better because they think they're going to get corrected. They get better because they want to do the right thing. And that was evident with a few really good dogs when I started, and it's probably more evident now, because I think that's what more of our goal is now, is to convince the dog that doing it my way is good for you and me. That's a little too romantic, but you.
Well, there's a romantic side to it, and I remember when you said a dog was sensitive, that was immediately a bad thing. And today you say, I want to hear more.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I realized that sensitivity and desire were not the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
that sensitivity managed properly is a wonderful trait.
Do you think you knew that when you first started?
No, I know I didn't.
So, again, I'm going to say, you can ask me this too. I'm going to say, how many dogs do you think you didn't get as much out of as you could? Like, isn't that the truth? And so here's another thing about what's good about today versus 40 years ago. More dogs that are a little more sensitive or have little quirks are becoming really good dogs in field trials than ever before.
Mm-hmm.
We are now looking at dogs more as individuals than just this cafeteria of dogs having to go through paces. And the guys who are doing basics now, the good ones are the guys that can match maturity levels with the challenge, and they make really good decisions about how much pressure to use. Because let's face it, if you don't have a lot of experience and you're doing basics for the first or second time, and you have to start making decisions on, do I do my initial collar conditioning on 5, 3, 2, 1? Because you got those options now with the collar.
Mm-hmm.
And those are really hard decisions. And when we first started and didn't have that option, we were like, okay, the next 2 days, sorry, you're going to get burning practice by learning how to sit with a burn. Like, I told you how to sit before I burned you, but now you're going to have to tolerate this big jolt and sit down, or you get burned again. Now, a few smart ones probably said, yeah, I can do that. A few tough ones said, you ain't nothing to me. I'll do anything, and as long as I can get a bird. But dogs have to be so much more thinking today than ever. We can't have a quarter of their mind anymore. We need all their mind to be competitive in field trials. They may be able to get through the Derby and some qualifying work, not giving us 100% of their mind. But, if you're going to be on a circuit and qualify for nationals, boy, you're going to have to give us more than half your mind. And you're going to have to be more consistent than just a trial or two a year, which is another big difference. Back in the day, there were more dogs that, if they had that certain test, they could do it, or that certain water bind, they could do it, but they weren't good at a lot of things. Like one of the hard tests when we first started was an inline triple, right? And it's one of the reasons that dogs changed, because dogs that had got too much pressure couldn't do short birds,
Right.
right? And Dave Rohr's got that great story about getting beat by Mike Lardy at a national or something, and Dave runs over to Rex and says, "Rex, we got to do something. Mike's beat me 2 times in a year. Our dogs can't get short birds, you know." And so, talk about that initial example. I said, what if we trained 40 years ago or 50 years ago, the way we were training now? That's sort of what happened with Mike, and Mike and I, when I
Yeah.
joined, that it was starting to draw attention to dogs that were more relaxed. Dogs could do a short bird, they could do a long retired gun, they could get in the water at a distance in a crosswind, and they looked like they were having fun doing it.
Yeah.
And people stood up. People like Dave Rorm, who was not a big fan. He was more of a direct kind of trainer. He's a wonderful trainer. Was then. He's certainly a wonderful trainer now. But there was a time that he had to pivot away from the direction he was going because he saw a group of dogs that were getting trained differently,
And they were succeeding.
and they were successful.
So, I mean, it really gets back to the evolution of about the changing of today's retrievers. And so we found techniques to promote and succeed with sensitive dogs. So sensitive dogs get bred more. And when you breed a trait, you're going to perpetuate that trait. And that's certainly what happened. And now the technology, the training techniques, and these dogs were more user-friendly for owners and owners.
Another huge thing. Today in the open, there is many amateur handlers that are competing to a real high level. It wasn't that way when we started.
Correct.
I could probably list 5 people that would get into the last series of an open. Like Charlie. Charlie had this is my early lifetime, was marathon.
Canada Woods Mad Mouse, Marathon Man.
Marty, Marathon Man,
Yeah.
for example, and Jackie Mertens with Cotton. There was a few more, but there wasn't that many. The last series would be like full of pros or a pros dog. That was it, and a few spotted amateurs. Today, more people are retiring. More people are spending more time. More amateurs have dog trucks. More amateurs are serious. More amateurs have their own training groups. They have winter training grounds and northern training grounds. But they also, whether it was because of Pat Burns' videos and Mike Lardy's videos, or because the whole game just got so elevated that information was at people's fingertips. And if you just had half a brain, and you wanted to be successful, and you were blessed with a decent dog, and you were willing to put the time in, that was the formula.
Probably the biggest shift in mindset for me professionally was that I think there was a large part of my early part of the career, I always tried to do the hardest test I could find. I was always looking for opportunities to make corrections, and I thought that was the definition of a great day. And then, now again, I still try to really challenge dogs and people, but I spend equal amount of time, if not more, looking for opportunities to reward good behavior instead of always looking for chances to correct bad behavior. And that was probably the biggest shift, and finding that balance between those two. And so, and again, it was like you didn't feel like you'd accomplished anything unless you corrected a dog in the old days. And that couldn't be any more wrong today. And you read dogs' behavior slipping, and by all means they get corrected. But it is not the goal every time you step out of the truck like it used to be.
Back in the old days when we were younger, the correction was always the end of the story. Like, I caught him for a cheat. I caught him hunting behind a flyer. Now, we look for ways for dogs to have positive takeaways after the correction.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I'm just reiterating what you said. Before, it was more, I got him on a cheat. But if you got him on a cheat and he kind of accidentally got in the water or forgot where the bird was or didn't connect things, maybe it wasn't fruitless, but we look for more of a whole message now than ever before, where we can keep dogs connected when they make mistakes to what they need to do. and not have them be overwhelmed with pressure. Um, or not have them be overwhelmed with pressure.
So one other thing that's changed dramatically are the grounds that we compete on and the grounds that we train on. How much do you think that has had a factor? Because, well, and let me describe that to you at home. The majority of the training grounds and competition grounds were places you would hunt. They were fish and wildlife areas, marshes, refuges. You had heavy cover, in the Midwest and in the Great Lakes. You would be in these stump ponds where the dog had to climb over logs.
You never knew when you went to that field trial. You never knew what it was going to be. Were they going to have the refuge full, empty? Was there going to be a cornfield? And the judges had to just do what was there.
And then today, and then some people had training grounds. There were, were some of the classic, and there were probably 10 or 12 classic places in the country that were designed just for training, usually groomed pretty close. Now there's 50 in a 50-mile radius from where we're sitting right now. And now we not only train on those grounds, we compete on those grounds. Do you think that's had a change affected the dogs?
I think it's had a lot of change. When you were talking that way, it reminds me, like, so our national rotates, from coast to coast. And there's been a couple times where we've got caught in cold weather. And part of the field trial community will say, well, dogs should never run in, water temperatures that are in the mid-40s. And the old timers are like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Like, how many times we've both been to nationals where you had to break ice so the dogs wouldn't cut themselves.
Right.
Now, I'm not suggesting that we should go back to that, but another thing that's changed, there was more expected out of the dog to endure those things. I haven't seen a field trial in a cornfield for 10 years. We used to run them all the time. Our dogs are having cruciate disease at a greater rate now, and we want to stay at it. Is that a product of?
Have we created more fragile dogs?
Have we? That's exactly.
Or do they have to be more thoroughbred or pointer-like to do these extreme distances as today? I don't know the answer to that.
So getting back to the groomed grounds piece, and everything happens like so slowly. It's not like one thing caused another. Like, we run on groomed grounds now because it's safer, and there's more of them. And so we have to decide now if are those bad things or not. And I think most of us in the community feel it's a safer thing to be on grounds that are safe, just period. But what, like on the property that I'm on right now in Boston, well, a lot of these properties in Boston, Georgia, judges come there and set up tests that are twice as long as you've ever seen. And dogs are doing them. Like, if you would have told me 40 years ago a dog would stop at a whistle at 500 yards and being controlled at the end of a blind, I would say in your dreams. And every once in a while, not every field trial has a blind that's 500 yards, but there has been some 500-yard blinds. And these dogs are, if they can hear the whistle, they're pretty good about it, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a lot like what happens in the NFL. I think everybody's gotten faster, bigger, stronger. Linemen are running 4.8 40s. Guy's 320 pounds, he's running like a 4.8. Like, when I was growing up, if you were 300 pounds, you ran like a 5.9. They didn't even make you do the 40, I think most of this is for the good. I really, really do. Because dogs are thinking their way through things more than ever. And I'm a big fan of that. I'm a big fan about putting these problems in front of the dogs. And do you make it a little easier for them physically sometimes? The distance is a little harder, but also you don't throw them through the cattails like we used to, or the cornfields. They're tougher in a different way today. I would say that. They were simpler and tougher back then, and now they're. But I'd sure like to think that if I took one of these dogs duck hunting, like, he wouldn't think I was asking too much of him to go get. Back in the days when I really duck hunted, and you'd have one dog for three gunners, and you were on Lake Puckaway, in November, and it was like
6,000 acre body of water.
Yeah, and wavy, and maybe 20 degrees, and the water temperature in the mid 30s. And, I mean, you never thought twice about it. We didn't have vests then. Like, nobody, I mean, the dogs did well, and
So we psychologically and physically have changed these retrievers.
but they're more refined though.
Yeah,
But
yeah, they definitely are.
but that's which is really cool.
Yeah, and you pretty much answered my question. I said, have we lost anything by changing?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
It's hard to watch younger people sometimes say, "Oh, it's a little cold. I wish it wasn't so cold." You're like, this is like in Oregon when the water temperature was probably in the high 40s, 50s, maybe mid 50s, and it's the water and the air temperature is 40 degrees. It's chilly, but man, that's what these dogs, like we're old enough, and like that's what those dogs were bred to do.
Yeah.
Even though field trials have refined the breeding, it's still like that. I don't want to take that hard out of them. Like I don't want to do that.
Good stuff. Well, we just got a time check,
We do what we always do.
and we got a few questions. And hold on a minute, I'm trying to grab this paper here. Can you reach that, Andrew?
You made a thing with that.
Well, I'm going to take a question, and then we're going to tell. I asked Andy to think about a success story that he wanted to share, and he's going to make me read that success story. But I've got a question here. I've got two questions for Pat and Andy's class tonight. When introducing something new like diversion birds, poison birds, for example, do you use the teach, train, test method? If so, can you explain what you look for the dog to accomplish in the teach and train periods before testing?
Well, I've never heard it said that way, but it sounds like that's what we do. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm.
Like in the old days, we would hear. We got this from Rex. Well, what's the commandment number one?
Identify the task.
Yeah, then
Apply pressure.
yeah, but what is the you don't use pressure to.
Teach the dog, you use it to reinforce what's already been taught.
That's the three main commandments of Rex Carr, and so that shouldn't have ever changed.
Right.
So, but I would say some people are really good teachers, and when they get into the transition period, the where the dog has some gray areas, that's where the real learning begins. But I know that's
So teach would be identifying the task.
Yep.
Training is repeating the behavior over and over
yep, familiarizing the behavior. Yep.
in different contexts.
Yep.
And then I guess test is just using some of those lessons in a setup that's more complex.
Yep.
That's the way I would describe that.
Yep.
How do you teach a dog to do tighter marks?
Ooh. That's like an hour-long discussion, but that dog needs to know that it's about the bird, where the bird falls. And so through our training, they're not born being nervous around tight marks. We make them that way.
Right.
So we do things like we call them stupid quads. What ABC drills? What does Dennis call them?
Organized confusion.
Organized confusion. So we do things in a softer setting and try to make their lines really about the birds and do tight marks and make them as easy as possible for a while and then extend the distances to make them a little harder. Very seldom have I run across a dog that applying pressure to rectify a dog being nervous around marks works. It hardly ever works.
And I guess it goes back to the rewarding good behavior versus always correcting bad behavior. Because, the classic first test you do when you're starting is you do those derby tests where they go back to the flyer and they get in a lot of trouble. And you do that over and over, and your whole focus is to get them not to go back to the old fall, and that's what you obsess about until you get them to the point where they're afraid of the old fall. And when they're afraid of the old fall, they won't go tight. And I learned at some point that I really want my dogs not to go back to an old fall for one reason. There's not a bird there. We just don't do it. Not because you're always going to get in severe trouble for it. And once they do that, why would you go there? There's nothing there to get, kind of theory. Mm-hmm. And, and sometimes it takes longer because they do attempt to go back and you tell them not to do it and you repeat it, but you don't necessarily lower the boom maybe as heavy as you would have at one point.
Yeah, and those things are taught over a period of time. Like, it's a common mistake, particularly with a young trainer, to, if a dog goes back to an old fall and he just like, I'm gonna get you really hard now so you'll never do this again. And that's not how dogs learn. Like, it's not like, I'm gonna do this one time and you'll never have this ever happen to you again, because you'll never even think about going back to an old fall. You know, the challenges of tightening your marks up have to occur at maturity levels that can handle that challenge. And there's a lot of ways to deal with dogs being comfortable going near guns. You can do it on blinds, for example. And sometimes it's the best thing to do. If a dog acts like, we used to always, and I don't train that many Goldens anymore, but Goldens are kind of notorious for, flaring guns and things. And a lot of times it's a lot easier to teach those guys that concept on a blind. It's just not as stimulated. There's not, it's not like the memory bird thing, like, I forgot the bird anyway. I know one thing, I'm just not going to go back to an old fall.
Well, I don't see any questions up on the board, and if you have any, go ahead and pop them in there. But because we're approaching our hour mark, I am going to talk about, and again, I asked Andy about a success story that would be appropriate for tonight's talk. And didn't take you 2 seconds, and you said hawk. And you talked about Scott Leoneskew's hawk. And if you don't know the story behind this, hawk was a successful dog. Let me think about, what is he, 5 years oldish? How long? And he had his title. And Scott Leonescu, who owned the dog, ran him. And he was actually a little bit of kind of a handful at that point. Was kind of a challenge to keep under control. Well, Scott suffers a stroke. He
Massive stroke.
Pre-national training, right in June. He's getting ready to go to a national in Montana. I guess it would be 4.5 years ago, because it was 4 years ago Montana National, and then we just had it this last year, so it would have been 4.5 years ago. Hawk is 10, so the dog would have been 5.5 years old at this point, and didn't think Scott was going to live. And a lot of us thought he'd be better off if he didn't, because we thought Scott fought his way back. And we thought, well, he's never going to be able to run a dog. He can't even communicate. Well, that certainly wasn't the case. Scott went on, and Hawk went on to have just it just takes your heart away career. He went on and qualified for multiple nationals. Won opens, won amateurs.
Finished National Open. Finished the National Open.
Finished the National Open. And Hawk passed away this last summer. Ran the National Amateur. Developed, I don't even know exactly what it was, conditioning game, but he was close to 10, and he died pretty suddenly. Mm-hmm. And Andy, you wrote a obituary for him.
And Field Trail News.
And Field Trail News. And the dog's name was Silver Stars, Watch Him Like a Hawk. And Andy writes, every once in a while, if you're lucky, and if you're seasoned enough to realize it, a being becomes part of your life who's special, unique, and one in a million. You wrote this the night after he passed away?
I wrote this the hour after I heard it.
Hawk passed away last night, a week after completing a field trial where he probably did something just naughty enough to give him reserve jam. It is said that the good ones don't live long enough. But in Hawk's case, you made me read this. You said you couldn't keep a straight face. He will live forever in my eyes, and the others who witnessed this incredible being. Many dogs have earned what Hawk earned, finishing nationals, becoming titled, but the traits we will remember him by go way beyond those achievements. To watch Hawk take care of Scott after his illness, to watch a dog so motivated by his passion to retrieve, who could also adjust to Scott's new way of life, to watch how Hawk catapulted a disabled man who had goals and a stubborn tenacity to compete into a disabled man who became independent, breaking barrier after barrier and arriving at training and trials grabbing and fighting for every inch of experience we all strive for in our own lives. How do you put that into words? It is truly rare for a competitive dog to possess such an ability to solve a handler's problems. Combined with an insatiable desire to get birds, Scott and Hawk made it look as if this should be common and normal, but it's not. Scott's expectations for Hawk were met routinely when it appeared far from reality to the rest of us. If you've been in the game for a while, you can't help reaching for the romantic elements that keep you going sometimes. If one dog could reinforce and support that feeling that you can never really put your finger on regarding why this game truly appeals to the soul, that dog would be Hawk. What can you say?
That we were talking about, you know, one of my most favorite elements, and when I get a dog in training, is a dog. Again, you know, it's not obvious all the time, but like when they try to figure out what you want, and most of our dogs, you know, they're so prey driven. Like we're second or third on their list, you know. And he was that way for a long time. I mean, this dog was sort of a jerk. He was a pretty talented dog, and Mike and Ray did a great job with him until he was 3-ish, 3.5, 4 maybe, and then we got him. But he was kind of a naughty dog, and you know, did his own thing sometimes too. He'd have been better if he would have listened a little bit more. And I'm just somewhere around the time when Scott got sick, he just made an adaptation. Scott could only handle with one arm, and he had a left side stroke. Left brain stroke. So his whole right side was, you know, and if you'd ever watched him handle, it was hard for Hawk at the beginning. Hawk's sitting at a whistle at 380 yards, and Scott has to like rotate over just to get his arm there. And you know, at some point, he didn't do it right away, but at some point he's like, oh yeah, this is where my dad has to move a little bit, and I have to wait for him to give me a signal. Like, you would not have thought Hawk was ever capable of that. It was just amazing. And, you know, that attribute, like, that is the number one attribute. If you could see that in a dog where they kind of stop and say, well, what are you wanting me to do? Like, instead of like, let me get this bird first and then we'll talk about it.
Well, there's probably no greater example in the evolution of today's retriever than that story right there. So,
A special dog.
well, we do have a question. And I'm going to have, Robin, can you blow that up? Hit the control, and then right next to it, and then the plus button, so it'll blow it up, because I can't see it from this distance. Right there. There we go. A little bigger. All right, there we go. I think I can read it now. What are some suggestions for dealing with the dog that is extremely conscientious and can have difficulty dealing with tight scenarios? Under the arc poison birds, complex down the shore water blinds, due to self-induced mental pressure. This dog rarely gets corrections of any kind in training, so it's not due to e-collar pressure. Well, you're right. I guess you start promoting that sensitive dog, and sometimes it becomes a little too sensitive, maybe. Now, I guess you got that natural worrier that you talk about. I mean, it sounds like that's what we're looking at here.
Well, how about we look at it this way? Let's first of all say what we would be careful of and not do. So this would be to create this.
Oh, that's a good point.
So
are we talking about not ever having it begin, or dealing with it after,
that's right.
Where Jeff is?
I would say, if you knew that was was likely to happen, what would you do differently? Is that
Okay?
okay?
Right.
What not to do with a dog like this? Oftentimes, dogs of that nature get pushed a little harder in early transition and even through yard work. So every dog's developed a little bit different, and some dogs, you get this. Trainers will say, I got this dog through basics in 3 months or 2 months, or like it's a race, you know. Like I got the 6 week badge. Well, that is not important to us, you know. This, you're doing basics for a lifetime, and you know, and even early transition. This is about getting dogs a good start, you know, a foundation. So if you push them and put, like, just say that particular dog got, he was 11, 12 months old, was doing really good, and you say, okay, now he's doing so good, let's do underneath the arc poison birds. Like, it would just be inappropriate. Like, there's no reason, like, I would not do that with most 11-month-old dogs, if any. And I'm a professional dog trainer, so you kind of know what not to work on, number one, and then secondly, sometimes those kind of dogs, the more careful you are, you enable them to be soft about stress. And so putting them in a little bit of a stressful situation, but foundationally relatively simple, is where you can start to build that dog up a little bit. I'm not saying.
Well, and sometimes you're right. Sometimes they use that cop out factor as kind of their defense mechanism or their way of being defiant. Now, we're looking at two kind of extremes there. One, we're trying to protect them. One, we're trying to not let them be cop outs.
Okay, so I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I know we were gonna run out of time, but the other success story was a dog named Keeper. And Keeper was a High Point amateur dog. 1 year, I don't know how many, she had hundreds of points, over 100 points, well over 100. Keeper was with a young dog trainer, Jim Van Eyck, and then I had her for 2.5, 3 years, and then Mike and Ray had her. And she was really soft. She was real stubborn. She was real sensitive looking. She was real pouty. She went really slow on her blinds. There was just a lot of things that didn't look like they were going to be
Turn into a good dog.
Turn into a good dog. And I remember, and the owner, Jamie, was brand new. Really, it was her first dog. And I said, I predict that, she's smart, but I think, you're going to be frustrated with her because I'm not quite sure she's going to be able to tolerate, all the training and everything. So anyway, she runs good for Jamie in her first qualifying and wins. First blue ribbon for Jamie and first blue ribbon for Keeper. Okay, and then went, okay, now she's going to be a good dog, and then her attitude is terrible in training. She does all the things that he just described, flares marks. See, if she sees a piece of water, has to get in like fat because she doesn't want any trouble. Like everybody's killed her, which has not happened. So we sent her home for just a little bit, and Jamie took her duck hunting. Mm-hmm. And Jamie was with 5 women. So there were 6 women in the blind, and they were on, I think, the Tennessee River, and it was 32 degrees. Snowing and crappy weather. She was the only dog. She didn't want to quit. She called me up and she said, I don't know what you're doing to her in training, but this dog came back with ice on her fur, mud in her mouth, and she retrieved whatever the limit was for all those people and wanted more. And I said, thank you. And so you learn how to train a dog like that. You don't make her do a water blind every day. You hold her responsible on certain things.
She didn't rub her nose in it, right?
You didn't rub her nose in it. Exactly. That's a good way to put it. And so sometimes we so worry much, especially when they're young, you so worry about like them completing a task of going behind a gun for a blind or whatever the function, going underneath the arc of a poison bird. If you don't have other information, like to see if they have guts in other areas, and maybe like you need to know more before you say you have to do this or die. Like by Monday night, you're going to know this. Mm-hmm. Like for a young dog, what's really worth having to get done in a day or a week?
Right.
Like what is it? What really? I mean, they can't bite you. They have to pick a bird up when you ask them. They got to stop on a whistle. They have to go, stop and come. But if we think about all the things that we get into fights over with our dogs that are younger, like how important is that in the scheme of things that we find out that we have to do this today? Or in a week, how about we're going to do this over a month? Anyway, I don't know if that's going to help.
Well, that's good stuff, Andy. And, I guess that's pretty much our story. What and when do you do after all the double T drills? Well, and I'm not totally sure that I understand that question. What and when do you do after all the T drills? I assume you're coming out of basics when you're starting those beginning blinds. I guess, I think all of us follow a similar pattern and chart. when you start taking some of the basics lessons and go into the field. But we typically start a series of pattern blinds and simple blinds to kind of get the handling going. And you know, there there's a flow chart that I have that talks about, and I know Andy has a similar one, about the evolution of training and what happens when they come out of post basics. But you know, that's kind of a lot of some of these questions like we could spend an hour on that in itself.
Mm-hmm.
But
I'll tell you one difference. I just thought of this back 40 years ago and now. It was not common to do field work while you were doing basics
and it wasn't common to start dogs handling
until
till later.
after the Derby.
So you're right. There are some huge changes there.
So, and the only reason I bring that up is I think one of the biggest changes that has been helpful that we have gotten dogs out in the field quicker while they're doing their basics to give the dogs kind of a connection piece to why they're doing all this, and also stimulating their retrieve and not just having to go through the basic lesson alone. And I think dogs can have a better balance that way. So to answer your question, there's a lot of things you do that can be done right after the basic yard work. I would say our basic yard work stops after swim by, and then pattern blinds are the beginning of the next segment for the most part. But once you get past the yard work section, there's a lot of different avenues. Like if it's really cold, and you may start land blinds a little earlier. If it's really hot, you may do cheating singles a little earlier than you would normally. So, but this is really predicated on what kind of dog you have and where he responds. Some dogs are a little nervous about the water. Maybe you don't want to do cheating singles right away, or pressure in the water. And,
right, and you do plenty of therapy style retrieves and marks and setups along the way to, especially if you have, like you say, a dog that's a little bit delicate maybe, and and you're always anxious to go out and start playing with all the new tools you just finished in basics, but sometimes you got to be patient, and I think of I talked about success stories, but some of my frustrations were most oftentimes scenarios where I pushed too hard too fast. That would be, and you take that young dog that looked like gangbusters and you just thought, all right, when there's no looking back, and there comes a time where they realize, boy, this is harder than I thought.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many dogs that still perplex me, where they have such a great start in basics and they have such a great start until they're about 2. And then we call it like the sophomore jinx. All of a sudden, it's like things aren't making sense to them. And so you push them at the rate they were going 6 months earlier. And I still to this day, every once in a while, I have to catch myself. What am I doing? This dog's 2 years old. But he was doing so good 4 months ago. Well, the learning curve doesn't always have to go like this. Sometimes it goes, and sometimes it just steadies out for a while.
And sometimes it goes down before it comes back up.
Yeah.
Well, we could do this all night, but we got to wrap this up. And I have to say I'm a little bit sad. This is our 6th and final Purina Masterclass of the year, and we've had some great ones, and I've certainly enjoyed tonight as much as any. Spending the evening with a good friend, and I'm going to be spending the weekend with you, Andrew, and we're gonna continue. This kind of catapults us into our 4-day seminar that's going to start tomorrow morning, and I'm sure a lot of these discussions will continue over the course of the weekend. And keep in touch, and we're going to have a Q&A session this weekend, and there should be a good chance for you guys to catch a little bit more of that information and hear more about what we think about dogs. So once again, thank you, Purina. Thank you guys at Ray and Carl, and thank you folks at home for tuning in and being a part of the Purina Masterclass series and listening and letting Andy and I indulge in some nostalgia and some old time thoughts. But I hope that's helpful for you guys to develop your own opinion and continue the process of evolving, because it's going to continue to go on, and who knows where it's headed next. We got to keep striving. So thank you very much, and good night. And Andrew, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me be here.
And until next time, everybody, good training. Have a great holiday. And can't wait to see you again. Good night.